Welcome, dear listener. Find yourself settling into comfort, perhaps in your bed with soft pillows surrounding you, or maybe nestled in your favorite chair where the world feels distant and gentle. Take a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill your lungs and then slowly release. Let the tension of the day dissolve like morning mist under the sun. Tonight, we embark on a remarkable journey to a moment 74,000 years ago when everything changed for our species. When a single volcanic event shifted the entire trajectory of human development. Close your eyes if you wish, and let these words carry you back through time to witness how the Toba supereruption created a genetic bottleneck that effectively halted human biological evolution, shifting our development from physical adaptation to cultural and technological progress. To understand the magnitude of what happened 74,000 years ago, we must first travel back in time and paint a picture of the human world as it existed before the catastrophe. Imagine, if you will, the Earth during the late Pleistocene epoch, a world both familiar and utterly alien to our modern eyes. This was a planet still in the grips of an ice age, where vast glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere, sea levels stood hundreds of feet lower than today, and land bridges connected continents that are now separated by deep ocean waters. 75,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, had already been walking the earth for well over 100,000 years. We had emerged in Africa, likely in the eastern or southern regions of the continent, and by this time had begun to spread across the African landscape in small, scattered populations. These were our direct ancestors, people who looked remarkably like us, with the same basic body structure, the same capacity for complex thought, and the same potential for creativity and innovation that characterizes our species today. But while they looked like us and possessed our fundamental capabilities, the humans of 75,000 years ago lived in a world where biological evolution still shaped our species in powerful and ongoing ways. Natural selection continued to act upon human populations with the same force it had exerted for millions of years. Different environmental pressures in different regions were actively molding human biology, creating adaptive variations in response to local conditions. Consider the genetic diversity of these pre-Toba humans. Population genetic studies examining modern human DNA suggest that before the bottleneck, human populations harbored significantly more genetic variation than we see today. Different groups, scattered across Africa and perhaps beginning to venture into the Middle East, were evolving subtle adaptations to their specific environments. Some populations lived in the hot, dry savannas where water was scarce and the sun beat down relentlessly. Others inhabited cooler highland regions or dense forests where different survival challenges presented themselves. Physical adaptations were still occurring at a relatively brisk evolutionary pace. Body proportions varied among populations according to Bergmann's and Allen's rules. Populations in hotter climates tended toward longer limbs and leaner builds that maximized heat dissipation, while those in cooler regions showed more compact body structures that conserved warmth. Skin color was adapting to different levels of ultraviolet radiation exposure. Metabolic systems were fine-tuning themselves to available food sources. The human immune system was actively evolving in response to the specific pathogens encountered in different regions. Research suggests that the total human population before the Toba event was substantially larger than what came after, though still small by modern standards. Estimates vary, but genetic evidence points to an effective population size, the number of individuals successfully breeding and passing on their genes, of perhaps tens of thousands to over 100,000 individuals across the entire species. These humans were distributed primarily across Africa, with possible small populations venturing into the Middle East and perhaps Southern Asia, though the exact extent of pre-Toba human dispersal remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. These populations were not static. They moved, mingled, separated, and came together again over generations. Gene flow between groups, the exchange of genetic material through interbreeding, maintained some level of connection across the broader human population while still allowing for local adaptations to develop. This balance between connection and isolation, between shared genetics and local variation, is the engine that drives evolutionary change in any species. The humans of this era were already remarkably sophisticated in many ways. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that our ancestors were capable toolmakers, crafting increasingly refined stone implements. They controlled fire, a technology that had been mastered hundreds of thousands of years earlier. They hunted large game cooperatively, requiring coordination and communication. They created shelters and clothing from available materials. They had developed complex social structures and likely possessed language, though the specifics of early human communication remain elusive. Yet despite these cultural achievements, physical evolution remained the primary mechanism through which human populations adapted to their environments. If a group moved into a colder climate, natural selection would favor individuals whose bodies were better suited to retain heat. If drought struck a region, those with more efficient water conservation systems would have reproductive advantages. If new diseases emerged, individuals with resistant immune systems would be more likely to survive and pass on their genes. The pace of this biological evolution was relatively rapid compared to the timescales we typically associate with evolutionary change in long-lived species. Humans have a generation time of approximately 20 to 30 years, meaning that genetic changes favorable enough to increase in frequency could spread through populations over hundreds or thousands of years. Quick by geological standards, though glacially slow from a human lifetime perspective. Different human populations were also encountering different selective pressures based on their lifestyles and environments. Groups that relied heavily on hunting large animals would face different evolutionary pressures than those who gathered more plant foods. Populations living in mountainous terrain would adapt differently than those on open plains. Coastal groups developing technologies to exploit marine resources would face unique challenges and opportunities compared to inland populations. This ongoing biological evolution was creating a mosaic of human diversity across the landscape. While all humans remained one species, capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring, regional differences were accumulating. This is the normal pattern of evolution for a widespread species. Populations diverge genetically in response to local conditions while maintaining enough connection to remain part of the same species. The human brain itself was still subject to evolutionary pressures. While brain size had reached approximately modern levels by this time, the fine details of brain structure and function could still be shaped by natural selection. Cognitive abilities that enhanced survival and reproduction in specific environments would be favored. The capacity for social learning, problem-solving, communication, and innovation all had genetic components that could be acted upon by selection. Importantly, humans of 75,000 years ago still faced significant mortality from environmental causes. Infant and child mortality rates were high. Many individuals died before reaching reproductive age. Predators, accidents, diseases, injuries, exposure to harsh weather, starvation during food shortages, complications during childbirth, all of these took their toll. This high mortality created strong selective pressure. Those individuals whose genes helped them survive these challenges to reproduce successfully would be the ones shaping the next generation. The relationship between biology and culture in this pre-Toba world was one where biology still held the upper hand. While cultural innovations like tool use, fire control, and clothing certainly provided advantages, these technologies were relatively simple and changed slowly. A new tool design might take centuries or millennia to spread across populations. Cultural transmission occurred primarily within small family groups or bands, limiting how quickly innovations could propagate. Genetic evolution and cultural evolution proceeded at roughly comparable paces, with neither dramatically outstripping the other. This was a world where the rules that had governed primate evolution for millions of years still applied fully to humans. We were subject to the same mechanisms of natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and mutation that shaped all living things. Our destiny as a species was written primarily in our genes, modified slowly over countless generations by the impersonal forces of evolutionary biology. Then, 74,000 years ago, everything changed. A mountain exploded on the other side of the world, and the trajectory of human evolution took a dramatic and irreversible turn. On an otherwise ordinary day 74,000 years ago, during the Northern Hemisphere summer season, deep beneath the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, tremendous forces reached a breaking point. For centuries, perhaps millennia, magma had been accumulating in a vast underground chamber, fed by the collision of tectonic plates in one of Earth's most volcanically active regions. Pressure built inexorably as more molten rock forced its way into the chamber. The overlying rock strained and fractured, and volatile gases dissolved in the magma accumulated to critical levels. Then, in a sequence of events that unfolded over perhaps 9 to 14 days, the Toba supervolcano erupted in what remains the largest known explosive volcanic event in human history and one of the most powerful eruptions of the past 28 million years. This was not merely a volcano erupting. This was a planet-altering catastrophe, an explosion so massive that it defies easy comprehension. To understand the scale of this event, let us put it in context. You may be familiar with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, which destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. You might know of the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which ejected so much material into the atmosphere that it caused a year without a summer in 1816, leading to crop failures and famine across Europe and North America. Perhaps you have heard of the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, whose explosion was heard 3,000 miles away and generated tsunamis that killed tens of thousands. The Toba eruption dwarfed all of these. Scientists estimate that Toba expelled at least 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, a volume almost impossible to visualize. That represents enough rock, ash, and pumice to bury the entire United Kingdom under approximately 12 meters of debris. It represents a volume 100 times greater than the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, which was the largest volcanic eruption observed in modern times. The Toba event was 12% more powerful than even the last major Yellowstone eruption 2.2 million years ago. The eruption registered 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the maximum value on the scale, and a rating reserved for what are called super eruptions, events that eject over 1,000 cubic kilometers of material. To earn this rating, an eruption must be not just large but truly catastrophic in its global impact. The Toba event stands as one of only a handful of super eruptions known from Earth's geologic record, and the most recent such event in the Quaternary period. The eruption sequence began with relatively small precursor events, warning signs that went unheeded because there were no humans nearby to observe them. Then came the main eruptive phase, characterized by massive pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock fragments that raced across the landscape at hundreds of kilometers per hour, incinerating everything in their path. These flows carved out a massive caldera, a giant collapsed crater that measures approximately 100 kilometers long, 30 kilometers wide, and plunges to depths exceeding 500 meters below what would eventually become the water's surface. Today, this caldera is filled with water, forming Lake Toba, the largest volcanic lake on Earth. But 74,000 years ago, as the eruption raged, this was ground zero of planetary catastrophe. The immediate devastation extended for hundreds of kilometers in all directions. Forests were obliterated. Rivers boiled and evaporated. Entire ecosystems were sterilized by the combination of intense heat, thick ash deposition, and toxic gases. Any humans who might have lived within this zone of total destruction would have perished instantly, though there is no evidence that Homo sapiens had yet reached Sumatra at that time. But the local devastation, terrible as it was, represented only the beginning of Toba's global impact. The tremendous force of the eruption hurled billions of tons of material high into the atmosphere. Volcanic ash, fragments of pulverized rock, and volcanic glass spread across vast regions. Deposits of toba ash 15 centimeters thick have been found across India and the Indian Ocean. Microscopic glass shards called cryptotephra, particles so tiny that thousands could fit within the width of a human hair, were carried by atmospheric winds across Africa, Asia, and beyond. These cryptotephra have proven invaluable to scientists studying the toba event. Because volcanic glass has a distinctive chemical fingerprint specific to each eruption, researchers can identify toba particles in sediment layers around the world, providing a precise time marker in the geological and archaeological record. By analyzing where and how thickly toba ash was deposited, scientists have reconstructed the eruption's global reach and impact. The ash itself caused immediate problems. Imagine a blanket of gray powder settling over everything, coating leaves, filling streams, contaminating water sources, and making the air difficult to breathe. In regions close to the eruption, this ash layer measured meters thick. Even thousands of kilometers away, substantial accumulations would have buried vegetation, poisoned water supplies, and created an eerie, dead landscape. But the ash was merely the most visible manifestation of the eruption's impact. Far more significant for the global climate was the massive injection of gases into the stratosphere. Volcanic eruptions release enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide, which reacts with water vapor in the atmosphere to form sulfate aerosols, tiny particles that remain suspended at high altitude for years. These aerosols are highly reflective, bouncing incoming sunlight back into space before it can warm Earth's surface. Scientists estimate that toba injected somewhere between 100 trillion and 1,000 trillion grams of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The range is wide because reconstructing the exact chemistry of a 74,000-year-old eruption is challenging. Even at the lower end of this range, the sulfur release was 100 times greater than the Pinatubo eruption. The resulting aerosol cloud spread across the entire globe, creating a hazy veil between Earth and the Sun. The climatic effects of this aerosol veil have been the subject of intense scientific study and debate. Climate models simulating the toba eruption suggest that global average temperatures dropped by 3.5 to over 10 degrees Celsius in the immediate aftermath, depending on the exact amount of sulfur injected. This cooling effect peaked within the first few years after the eruption and persisted for perhaps a decade or more before the aerosols gradually settled out of the atmosphere. A temperature drop of this magnitude would have had dramatic effects. Summer seasons would have been weak or nearly absent in many regions. Growing seasons would have been drastically shortened. Tropical regions accustomed to consistent warmth would have experienced unprecedented cold snaps. The term volcanic winter has been used to describe this period, a time when the Earth's climate system was shocked into a state far outside its normal parameters. Some researchers have proposed that the toba eruption may have contributed to or triggered a longer-term cooling episode, possibly extending the already cold conditions of the ongoing ice age. The timing of the eruption coincides with the transition into marine isotope stage 4. A period of particularly severe glaciation. However, whether toba actually caused this extended cold period or simply occurred at the same time remains controversial. Recent climate modeling suggests that while toba could create intense short-term cooling, it probably could not initiate a 1,000-year ice age on its own, though it might have reinforced and extended existing cooling trends. The effects of this volcanic winter on living systems would have been severe. Plants dependent on photosynthesis would have struggled under reduced sunlight. In many regions, crops would have failed. Though the humans of 74,000 years ago were not yet farming, they relied on wild plants that would have been equally affected. Trees would have experienced stunted growth or dieback. The reduction in plant productivity would have cascaded up the food chain, affecting herbivores and then the carnivores that preyed upon them. For early humans scattered across Africa and possibly nearby regions, the toba event would have been catastrophic. Consider the experience from a human perspective, the sky gradually darkening over days or weeks as ash and aerosols accumulated in the atmosphere, temperatures dropping dramatically and staying cold, familiar water sources fouled by ash, plants withering or failing to fruit, game animals disappearing or dying, the sun reduced to a dim ghost of itself even at midday. These humans had no framework for understanding what had happened. They could not know that a mountain had exploded half a world away, or that the strange ash falling from the sky had traveled thousands of kilometers on high-altitude winds. They would only know that their world had suddenly become hostile in unprecedented ways. Food became scarce. Water sources were contaminated. The reliable seasonal patterns that governed plant growth and animal movements were disrupted. Archaeological evidence from sites in Africa and India that contain toba ash layers provides glimpses into how humans responded to this crisis. At some sites, there is evidence of cultural continuity. Tool traditions continue relatively unchanged across the ash layer, suggesting that local populations survived and maintained their way of life despite the disruption. At other locations, there are signs of population decline or abandonment, with reduced evidence of human activity in the period immediately following the eruption. Particularly intriguing are findings from sites like Shinfamatima in Ethiopia and Daba in India, where detailed archaeological work has revealed how human populations adapted. At Shinfamatima, analysis of animal remains and geological evidence suggests that the post-Toba environment became significantly more arid. Rivers dried into shallow pools, concentrating fish populations that became easy prey. Humans at this site appear to have shifted their diet to exploit these newly available resources, demonstrating the behavioral flexibility that would become increasingly important to our species' survival. The Toba eruption was not, as initially hypothesized, the instant apocalypse that wiped out most of humanity in a single blow. Humans survived. But survival came at a terrible cost, and the event created conditions that would fundamentally reshape the genetic and evolutionary trajectory of our species. The concept of a population bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in population size that creates a corresponding reduction in genetic diversity, is one of the most important ideas in evolutionary biology. When a population crashes to very low numbers and then expands again, the genetic consequences can persist for hundreds of thousands of years, shaping the evolutionary potential of all future generations. The evidence for a severe bottleneck in human prehistory comes not from fossils or archaeological sites, though these provide supporting evidence, but from the DNA of living people. Every human alive today carries in their genome a record of their ancestors' history, written in the patterns of genetic variation that exist within and between populations. By analyzing these patterns using sophisticated mathematical models, geneticists can work backward to infer what the size and structure of ancestral human populations must have been. These genetic analyses have revealed something striking. Compared to our closest living relatives, the great apes, humans display remarkably low genetic diversity. When you sequence the genomes of two randomly selected humans from anywhere on Earth, you find that they are incredibly similar at the genetic level, far more similar than two chimpanzees, two gorillas, or two orangutans taken from much smaller geographic ranges. This pattern has been known since the earliest days of human genetics, and it demands an explanation. The most parsimonious explanation for low genetic diversity is a population bottleneck, a period when the total number of breeding humans was very small, creating a genetic bottleneck that eliminated much of the variation that had previously existed. When population size is small, genetic drift, the random fluctuation of gene frequencies from generation to generation, becomes much more powerful, and many genetic variants can be lost simply by chance. Early genetic studies examining particular genes estimated that the human effective population size, the number of individuals actually contributing genes to the next generation, was maintained around 10,000 individuals for much of recent human evolutionary history. This is a remarkably small number for a species distributed across multiple continents. More comprehensive analyses examining complete genome sequences from thousands of people have confirmed and refined this picture, showing that human populations indeed went through one or more severe constrictions. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis, first proposed by anthropologist Stanley Ambrose in 1998, offered a potential explanation for this genetic bottleneck. Ambrose suggested that the volcanic winter caused by the Toba eruption reduced human population numbers to perhaps as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. Some estimates even suggested the population might have crashed to just 1,000 to 2,000 breeding pairs. This devastating population crash would have created an evolutionary bottleneck that reduced human genetic diversity dramatically. According to this hypothesis, most human genetic lineages that existed before Toba simply went extinct. Entire populations died out without leaving descendants. The genetic variation they carried was lost forever. Only those few thousand individuals who managed to survive the volcanic winter and its aftermath became the ancestors of all subsequent humans. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of US, would be descended from this tiny group of survivors. The location of these survivors remains uncertain, though genetic evidence and climate modeling suggest they were primarily in Africa, possibly concentrated in regions that were somewhat buffered from the worst effects of the volcanic winter. East Africa, with its diverse topography and varied ecological zones, may have provided refugia where humans could survive even under greatly stressed conditions. Some populations may have survived in southern Africa, perhaps along the coast where marine resources could supplement dwindling terrestrial food supplies. Small populations might have hung on in the Middle East or South Asia, though the genetic contribution of these groups to modern humans is unclear. The duration of the bottleneck is also a matter of ongoing research. Some genetic analysis suggests that human population numbers remained depressed for thousands or even tens of thousands of years after the initial Toba event, potentially because the eruption occurred during a period of general climatic deterioration associated with the transition into glacial conditions. Only around 50 to 60,000 years ago did human populations begin to expand significantly, eventually leading to the major dispersals out of Africa that would populate the rest of the world. However, it is important to note that the exact relationship between the Toba eruption and the human genetic bottleneck remains scientifically controversial. Not all researchers accept that Toba was the primary cause of reduced human genetic diversity. Some point to evidence that human populations were already in decline before the eruption, possibly due to changing climate conditions during the Ice Age. Others note that archaeological evidence from several sites shows cultural continuity across the Toba ash layer, suggesting that at least some populations weathered the crisis without total collapse. Alternative explanations for the human genetic bottleneck have been proposed. One possibility is that human populations were kept small for extended periods by ecological factors unrelated to Toba, perhaps competition with other hominin species, disease outbreaks, or the inherent challenges of life during an ice age. Another possibility is that the bottleneck reflects primarily the founder effect associated with the out-of-Africa dispersal, where only a small subset of African genetic diversity was carried by migrating populations into Eurasia. More recent genetic studies have revealed additional complexity. Analysis of ancient DNA from archaeological remains shows that there was more genetic diversity among ancient human populations than simple bottleneck models would predict. Some research suggests that rather than a single global bottleneck, human populations may have experienced a series of local bottlenecks at different times, with some populations expanding while others contracted, creating a complex demographic history that is difficult to reconstruct from modern genetic data alone. Furthermore, an important study published in Science in 2023 identified an even more ancient and more severe bottleneck in human ancestry, occurring around 930,000 to 813,000 years ago and lasting for approximately 117,000 years. During this ancient bottleneck, the human ancestral population may have been reduced to just 1,280 breeding individuals. This discovery suggests that severe population constrictions have occurred multiple times in human evolutionary history, and that the relatively low genetic diversity we observe today may reflect the cumulative effect of multiple bottleneck events rather than a single catastrophe. Nonetheless, whether or not Toba was the sole or primary cause, the genetic evidence is clear that human populations did experience at least one severe bottleneck sometime in the relatively recent past, likely within the last 100,000 years. This bottleneck reduced human genetic variation substantially compared to what would be expected for a species with such a wide geographic distribution. The genetic consequences of this bottleneck extend far beyond simple numbers. When a population passes through a bottleneck, rare genetic variants are likely to be lost entirely. Genetic variants that existed at low frequencies in the larger pre-bottleneck population might disappear completely if none of the few survivors happen to carry them. Conversely, genetic variants that happen to be present in the surviving population may increase in frequency simply by chance, even if they provide no particular advantage. This loss of genetic diversity has profound implications for evolution. Natural selection works by favoring some genetic variants over others. The more genetic variation a population has, the more raw material selection has to work with, and the more effectively the population can adapt to changing conditions. Reduced genetic diversity means reduced evolutionary potential, fewer options for natural selection to choose among, and therefore slower potential for evolutionary change. For human populations emerging from the bottleneck, this meant that the rapid pace of biological evolution that had characterized earlier human history would begin to slow. With less genetic variation available, natural selection became less effective at producing major adaptive changes. Beneficial mutations would still arise and selection would still favor them, but the overall rate of evolutionary change would be constrained by the reduced genetic diversity. This is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Just as biological evolution was becoming constrained by reduced genetic diversity, another form of evolution was accelerating: cultural evolution. The same populations that had survived the Toba crisis and its aftermath, the same small groups of humans who had been forced to adapt or perish, were beginning to develop increasingly sophisticated cultural strategies for survival. And these cultural adaptations would, over the following tens of thousands of years, come to replace biological adaptation as the primary mechanism by which humans respond to environmental challenges. To understand how the bottleneck changed human evolution, we must first understand what genetic diversity means for evolutionary potential. Every individual human is born with new mutations, changes to the DNA sequence that arise during the process of copying genetic material. Most of these mutations are neutral, having no effect on survival or reproduction. Some are harmful, reducing fitness. A tiny fraction are beneficial, providing some advantage in specific environmental context. In a large, genetically diverse population, there is substantial variation in countless genes. This variation represents the raw material of evolution. When environmental conditions change, when climate shifts, when new diseases appear, when populations move into new habitats, natural selection can act on this existing variation, favoring individuals with genetic variants that enhance survival and reproduction under the new conditions. Consider a simple example. Suppose a human population encounters a period of severe food scarcity. Individuals vary genetically in their metabolic efficiency. Some people's bodies are slightly better at extracting nutrients from limited food or at maintaining function during periods of caloric deficit. In a crisis, these individuals would be more likely to survive and reproduce. Over many generations, the genetic variants responsible for this greater efficiency would become more common in the population. This is evolution by natural selection acting on standing genetic variation. But what happens when a population passes through a severe bottleneck? The bottleneck acts like a filter, and it is an imperfect, random filter. Many genetic variants are simply lost. If none of the survivors happen to carry a particular variant, it is gone forever, regardless of whether it might have been useful in future circumstances. The genetic variation that made human populations adaptable to changing conditions is dramatically reduced. Studies comparing genetic diversity across species provide striking evidence of this bottleneck effect in humans. When geneticists examine variation in our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, they find substantially more genetic diversity than exists in humans, despite the fact that these apes have much smaller populations confined to limited geographic ranges. A population of a few thousand chimpanzees living in a single African forest contains more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans worldwide. This pattern is exactly what we would expect if humans had passed through one or more severe population bottlenecks while our ape relatives maintained larger, more stable population sizes. The bottleneck essentially reset human genetic diversity to a low level, and we have not had sufficient time since then to regenerate the variation that was lost. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from studies of human heterozygosity, the proportion of genetic sites where an individual carries two different versions of a gene. Humans show unusually low heterozygosity compared to most other primate species. When researchers compared the human genome to those of chimpanzees and other great apes, they found that chimps have roughly twice the genetic diversity of humans, despite humans having a current population size orders of magnitude larger. This reduced genetic diversity has measurable consequences for human health and evolution. Genetic variation in immune system genes, for instance, is crucial for a population's ability to resist diseases. The more variation exists in genes that recognize and respond to pathogens, the more likely some individuals will be resistant to any particular disease, and the less likely a single pathogen can devastate an entire population. Human immune gene diversity, while still substantial, is lower than in our closest relatives, potentially making us more vulnerable to novel diseases. The bottleneck also affected the distribution of deleterious mutations, genetic changes that reduce fitness. In a large population, harmful mutations are efficiently removed by natural selection before they can spread. But in a small population experiencing a bottleneck, some mildly harmful mutations can drift to higher frequencies simply by chance. Humans carry a higher load of such slightly deleterious mutations than would be expected for our current population size, likely reflecting the relaxed selection during bottleneck periods. Perhaps most importantly for our story, the bottleneck fundamentally changed the pace and nature of human adaptation. Before the bottleneck, when genetic diversity was higher, human populations could evolve relatively rapidly in response to new environmental pressures. Different populations could diverge genetically as they adapted to different conditions. Natural selection had a rich palette of genetic variants to work with. After the bottleneck, this changed. The reduced genetic diversity meant that evolution through natural selection became slower and more constrained. Beneficial mutations would still arise. Random copying errors in DNA replication ensured a constant trickle of new variation, but the pace of genetic change slowed. Populations expanding from the bottleneck were working with a reduced genetic toolkit. This timing, roughly 70,000 years ago and the millennia that followed, coincides with a critical period in human prehistory. It is during this time frame that we see the first strong archaeological evidence for many behaviors considered characteristically modern. Sophisticated stone tool technologies, long-distance trade networks, personal ornaments and art, complex weapons like bows and arrows, and increasingly elaborate social structures. Some researchers have suggested that the bottleneck itself, by forcing humans into small, stressed populations where cooperation and innovation were essential for survival, may have selected for cognitive and social abilities that enabled the explosion of cultural complexity that followed. While any individual genetic changes would have been subtle, the environmental and demographic conditions created by the bottleneck may have favored individuals who were particularly adept at social learning, cooperation, innovation, and cultural transmission. But here is the crucial point. While these cognitive abilities have genetic foundations, the behaviors they enable are primarily cultural. The human brain after the bottleneck was essentially the same as the human brain before it. No dramatic increase in brain size occurred, no revolutionary rewiring of neural circuits. What changed was not primarily our biology, but our culture, our accumulated knowledge, our technology, and our social systems. The genetic bottleneck thus created a paradox. Just as biological evolution was slowing due to reduced genetic diversity, human populations were facing increasingly varied and challenging environments as they began to expand from their refugia and eventually migrate across the globe. Populations moving into new regions encountered new climates, new ecosystems, new food sources, new challenges. How could humans adapt to this diversity without rapid biological evolution? The answer lay in a different kind of adaptation: cultural adaptation. Rather than waiting generations for beneficial mutations to arise and spread through genetic evolution, humans began to rely increasingly on learned behaviors, transmitted socially and improved upon by each generation. Instead of evolving thicker body hair to cope with cold, humans invented better clothing and shelter. Instead of evolving specialized digestive systems to process new foods, humans invented new food preparation techniques. Instead of evolving longer legs to run down prey, humans invented more effective weapons. This shift from biological to cultural adaptation did not happen suddenly. It was not a conscious decision, but rather a gradual transition driven by the combination of constrained genetic evolution and accelerating cultural evolution. But the bottleneck, by reducing the genetic raw material available for evolutionary change, may have been a key factor in pushing human populations to rely more heavily on cultural solutions to adaptive challenges. The implications of this shift are profound. Unlike biological evolution, which operates on generational timescales and is constrained by genetic mutation rates and selection pressures, cultural evolution can occur within a single lifetime. A useful innovation can spread through a population in years or decades rather than millennia. Cultural knowledge can accumulate, with each generation building on the innovations of the previous one. Cultural information can be transmitted not just from parent to offspring, but from any individual to any other, dramatically accelerating the spread of beneficial behaviors. In essence, the bottleneck may have opened a new evolutionary pathway for humanity. And this cultural evolution would prove far more powerful, far more rapid, and far more flexible than the biological evolution that had shaped all life on Earth for billions of years. In the tens of thousands of years following the bottleneck, whether caused primarily by TOBA or by the cumulative effects of Ice Age population stress, human populations began to expand again. As they did, they carried with them not just their genes but their cultures. Their knowledge of how to make tools, how to find food, how to survive in harsh conditions, and how to work together. And increasingly, it was these cultural adaptations, rather than genetic ones, that would determine success or failure. To understand this shift, we must first recognize that culture, in the broadest sense of learned, socially transmitted behavior, is not unique to humans. Many animals exhibit cultural behaviors. Chimpanzees use different tool traditions in different populations. Killer whales have distinct hunting techniques passed down through family groups, and songbirds learn their species-specific songs from adults. Culture exists wherever behavior is learned rather than purely instinctive, and where that learned behavior varies between populations in ways that cannot be explained by genetic or environmental differences alone. What makes human culture different is its scale, its complexity, and its cumulative nature. While a chimpanzee troop might use stones to crack nuts and pass this technique to their offspring, the technique remains essentially static over thousands of years. Humans, by contrast, create cultural traditions that build upon themselves, with each generation adding refinements and innovations that accumulate over time. This is cumulative cultural evolution, and it appears to be rare or absent in other species. The archaeological record from the period following the bottleneck shows increasingly clear evidence of this cumulative cultural evolution. Stone tool technologies become more sophisticated and diverse. The Middle Stone Age in Africa, spanning roughly from 300,000 to 30,000 years ago, sees the development of blade tools, hafted spears, and eventually projectile weapons like spear throwers and bows. These innovations represent not just isolated clever ideas but accumulated technological knowledge being refined and improved over generations. Personal ornamentation appears in the archaeological record starting around 100,000 years ago and becoming more common after 70,000 years ago. Beads made from shells, pierced teeth, and ochre pigments all suggest symbolic behavior and possibly language complex enough to convey abstract meanings. These objects serve no direct survival purpose. You cannot eat a bead or use it to kill game. Their presence indicates that humans were investing time and energy in social communication, group identity, and perhaps art for its own sake. The famous engraved ochre pieces from Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating to approximately 72,000 years ago, just before or contemporaneous with the Toba eruption, represent some of the earliest, unambiguous evidence of symbolic thought. These pieces of ochre stone are deliberately etched with geometric patterns, cross-hatching, parallel lines, abstract designs. Recent experimental studies examining these engravings found that they evolved over 30,000 years to become more visually salient, more memorable, easier to reproduce, and more expressive of group identity. They served as decorations and markers of cultural tradition, passed down and refined across generations. Similarly, shell beads from Bismarck Cave in Morocco date to 142,000 years ago, indicating that bead-making traditions were already established in northern Africa long before populations migrated to Europe. The beads at this site and others show evidence of having been strung together, worn on the body, and stained with ochre, suggesting they served as personal adornment conveying social information, perhaps marking group membership, social status, individual identity, or rites of passage. What makes this cultural flourishing particularly significant is that it coincides temporally with the genetic bottleneck. As human populations were being squeezed through the eye of the needle, whether by Toba, broader climatic deterioration, or other factors, those who survived were increasingly relying on cultural innovations to cope with environmental stress. The populations that made it through were not necessarily those with the best physical adaptations, but rather those with the most sophisticated cultural toolkits and social cooperation strategies. Language, though it leaves no direct fossil evidence, likely played a crucial role in this cultural transmission. The complexity of behaviors we observe in the archaeological record, multi-step tool manufacturing processes, coordinated hunting strategies, symbolic communication through art, strongly suggest that language was already well developed by this time. Language allows for the transmission of complex information that cannot be easily demonstrated through observation alone. It enables humans to discuss things that are not immediately present. Past events, future plans, hypothetical scenarios, abstract concepts. With language comes the ability to teach explicitly rather than relying solely on observational learning. A parent can explain to a child not just how to make a tool but why each step matters, what to do if something goes wrong, how to adapt the technique to different materials. A group can plan a coordinated hunt days in advance, assigning roles and discussing contingencies. Elders can share knowledge gained over lifetimes, stories encoding survival strategies and cultural values that persist across generations. This ability to share accumulated knowledge culturally created a new evolutionary dynamic. In biological evolution, information is transmitted vertically from parents to offspring through genes, with occasional horizontal transfer through interbreeding between populations. Cultural evolution allows information to move horizontally as well as vertically. Any individual can learn from any other, innovation can spread rapidly across populations, and beneficial cultural traits can be adopted without waiting for genetic change. Most importantly, cultural evolution is cumulative in ways that biological evolution is not. Each generation can build upon the innovations of the previous one. A better spearpoint design doesn't replace earlier designs through genetic mutation and selection over thousands of years. It can spread through a population within decades as people observe and copy the innovation. That improved design can then be further refined, with each improvement building on previous ones, creating a ratchet effect where cultural complexity increases over time. The archaeological record from the period following the bottleneck shows this cumulative cultural evolution accelerating. Stone tool technologies become increasingly diverse and sophisticated. The use of bone, antler, and ivory for tools and ornaments increases. There is evidence of long-distance trade networks, with raw materials like high-quality stone and marine shells being transported hundreds of kilometers from their sources. Hafting, attaching stone points to wooden shafts with adhesives, becomes more common and sophisticated, creating composite tools that combine different materials for enhanced functionality. Around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, corresponding roughly with the major expansion of human populations out of Africa and into Eurasia, we see an explosion of cultural innovation, sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution or Great Leap Forward. This is when unambiguous evidence of art appears in the European archaeological record. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, carved figurines like the Venus of Willendorf, complex personal ornaments, elaborate burials indicating belief in an afterlife, and sophisticated hunting technologies including spear throwers and eventually bows and arrows. However, as recent research has shown, this revolution in Europe was not a sudden emergence of modern human cognition. Cognitive modernity had been developing in Africa for tens of thousands of years prior. What happened 40,000 years ago in Europe was more likely the arrival of already cognitively and culturally sophisticated humans into a new region where the archaeological record preserves their activities particularly well. The European Upper Paleolithic represents not the origin of symbolic culture but its flowering in a particular time and place, building upon foundations laid much earlier in Africa. Critically, all of this cultural evolution was occurring while biological evolution was constrained by the reduced genetic diversity caused by the bottleneck. The human populations creating these sophisticated technologies, art forms, and social systems were genetically less diverse than their pre-bottleneck ancestors. Their brains had not grown larger. Indeed, cranial capacity has remained essentially constant or even slightly decreased over the past 100,000 years. Their bodies were not dramatically different from ours today, yet their cultures were undergoing revolutionary change, allowing them to adapt to an extraordinary range of environments without requiring genetic change. This represents a fundamental shift in human evolution. Before the bottleneck, when genetic diversity was higher, human populations adapted to new environments primarily through biological evolution. Bodies changed shape to suit different climates. Digestive systems adapted to available foods. Immune systems evolved in response to local diseases. After the bottleneck, with genetic evolution constrained, cultural evolution took over as the primary means of adaptation. Populations invented clothing to cope with cold rather than waiting to evolve heavier body hair. They developed cooking techniques to make new foods digestible rather than evolving new digestive enzymes. They created weapons and defensive strategies rather than evolving physical strength or armor. The survivors of the bottleneck were, in a sense, the founders of a new evolutionary strategy for the human lineage. Not intentionally, of course. They were simply using the tools available to them to survive and reproduce. But the effect was to shift human evolution from the primarily biological track that had governed life on Earth for billions of years to a new track where culture, technology, and accumulated knowledge became the dominant forces shaping human adaptation. Once the shift toward cultural evolution began in earnest, technology became humanity's primary adaptive strategy. Every environmental challenge that in other species would be solved through genetic change and biological adaptation became, for humans, a technological problem. This technological approach to adaptation has proven to be extraordinarily powerful and flexible, allowing humans to inhabit environments for which we are woefully unsuited biologically. Consider cold climates. Most mammals that live in cold regions have evolved thick fur coats, layers of insulating fat, compact body shapes that minimize heat loss, and metabolic adaptations that allow them to maintain body temperature efficiently. Polar bears, Arctic foxes, woolly mammoths, All these species evolved biological solutions to the problem of cold. Humans took a different path. Instead of waiting tens of thousands of years for natural selection to give us thicker body hair or more efficient metabolism, we invented clothing. The earliest definitive evidence for clothing comes from body lice genetics. These parasites split from head lice when humans began wearing clothes regularly, creating a new ecological niche. Genetic dating of this split suggests that humans may have been wearing clothing regularly by 70,000 to 120,000 years ago, right around the time of the bottleneck and during periods of severe glacial cold. Clothing represents a brilliant technological solution to thermal regulation. Unlike fur, which is fixed once you grow it, clothing can be added or removed as conditions change. It can be customized to available materials. Animal skins in some regions, woven plant fibers in others. It can be improved over generations as people discover better materials, cutting techniques, and sewing methods. And it works. Properly clothed humans can survive in Arctic conditions that would quickly kill us naked, despite having essentially no biological cold adaptations. Shelter provides another example. Most animals that deal with harsh weather either migrate to better climates, hibernate, or have evolved physical traits that allow them to withstand the conditions. Humans, by contrast, build houses. The archaeological record shows increasingly sophisticated shelter construction over time. Early humans used natural caves and rock shelters, but by the Upper Paleolithic we see evidence of constructed dwellings. Post holes for supporting frames, hearths positioned for maximum heating efficiency, storage pits, and even semi-subterranean structures that take advantage of Earth's insulating properties. Like clothing, artificial shelter is infinitely customizable. Igloo blocks in the Arctic, mud brick structures in arid regions, raised houses in flood-prone areas, insulated wooden buildings in temperate zones. Each design represents a cultural solution to local environmental challenges, developed through experimentation and refined over generations. And unlike biological adaptations that take millennia to evolve, architectural innovations can spread through populations quickly and be modified within lifetimes. Fire control represents one of humanity's most important and earliest technologies. Evidence for controlled fire use extends back at least 400,000 years and possibly much earlier. Fire provides warmth, extending the range of climates humans can inhabit. It provides light, allowing activity after dark and into deep caves. It protects against predators. And perhaps most significantly, fire enables cooking. Cooking is essentially outsourcing digestion. When we cook food, we are using fire to begin breaking down tough plant fibers, denaturing proteins, killing pathogens, and neutralizing toxins, work that would otherwise require more robust digestive systems. Many researchers believe that cooking may have been crucial in human evolution, allowing us to extract more nutrition from food and thereby supporting the metabolically expensive large brain that characterizes our lineage. But the key point is that cooking is a cultural practice, not a biological adaptation. We have not evolved specialized digestive systems for processing cooked food. Indeed, humans can still eat and digest raw food if necessary, though not as efficiently. What we have evolved is the cognitive capacity and social learning ability to maintain and transmit the cultural practice of cooking across generations. The biology enables the culture, which then does the adaptive work. Weapons and hunting technologies provide another clear example of cultural adaptation replacing biological evolution. Many predators have evolved impressive biological weaponry. Lions have powerful jaws and sharp claws, eagles have talons and beaks, snakes have venom. Humans have none of these biological weapons. We do not have particularly sharp teeth, strong jaws, fearsome claws, or any natural venom. An unarmed human is actually a rather poor predator physically. Yet humans are among the most successful predators on Earth, and we have been effective big game hunters for hundreds of thousands of years. Oh, technology. We invented weapons that far exceed anything biological evolution could produce. Spears extend our reach and amplify our force. Spear throwers, otlotls, and bows increase range and power dramatically. Poisoned arrows add venom without requiring biological venom production. Traps and snares allow us to hunt without even being present. Coordinated group hunting with driven game enables us to take down animals many times our size and strength. Each of these technologies can be improved incrementally. Better spear point shapes are more effective. Improved bow designs shoot farther and more accurately. New poison recipes are more potent. Each generation can build on the innovations of the previous one, creating a cumulative increase in hunting effectiveness that proceeds far faster than biological evolution ever could. The same pattern applies to defense. Rather than evolving thick skin, armor plating, or camouflage coloration, humans developed shields, protective clothing, fortifications, and strategies for defense. Rather than evolving to run faster to escape predators, we created weapons and social structures that turned us from prey to predator. Our biological vulnerability is compensated for by technological and social adaptations. Food processing provides yet another example. Different human populations have occupied regions with vastly different available foods. Biological evolution would require each population to evolve specialized digestive systems, dentition, and metabolic pathways for their local food sources. This is what happened in other species. Herbivores evolved complex multi-cambered stomachs for fermenting plant material. Carnivores evolved short digestive tracts optimized for meat, and so on. Humans took a shortcut. We invented food processing techniques that make diverse foods edible. Grinding makes seeds and grains digestible. Leaching removes toxins from certain plants. Fermentation preserves foods and in some cases increases nutritional value. Drying, smoking, salting. All techniques for food preservation that extend the range of foods available and allow storage for lean times. Each cultural group developed specialized knowledge of local foods and how to process them, transmitted across generations without requiring genetic change. Perhaps most remarkably, some human populations have actually evolved genetic changes in response to cultural practices, demonstrating how culture can drive biological evolution. The clearest example is lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk sugar, lactose, as an adult. In most mammals, including most humans, the enzyme lactase that breaks down lactose is only produced during infancy. After weaning, production shuts down, rendering milk indigestible for adults. However, in populations with long histories of dairy farming, particularly in Northern Europe and parts of Africa and the Middle East, genetic mutations that keep lactase production active into adulthood have spread to high frequencies. This is a clear case of cultural practice, dairy farming, creating a new selective pressure that favored a genetic mutation, lactase persistence. Notably, different populations have evolved lactase persistence through different genetic changes, representing convergent evolution driven by similar cultural practices. But even this represents culture driving biology, not the other way around. The initial cultural innovation, domesticating animals and consuming their milk, came first. Only afterward did genetic evolution catch up, and only in populations that maintain the cultural practice long enough for beneficial mutations to arise and spread. And notably, populations without lactase persistence can still consume dairy products by culturally processing them, making cheese and yogurt which have reduced lactose, or simply accepting digestive discomfort. The development of agriculture, beginning roughly 12,000 years ago in multiple regions independently, represents perhaps the most dramatic cultural transformation in human history. Agriculture fundamentally changed how humans related to their environment, their food sources, and each other. It enabled population growth, permanent settlements, food storage and surplus, specialization of labor, and eventually the rise of complex civilizations. Agriculture required no genetic changes to human biology. The same human brain and body that evolved for hunter-gatherer lifestyles proved fully capable of farming. What changed was culture. Knowledge of plant cultivation, animal husbandry, seasonal timing, storage techniques, and social organization. This knowledge was learned, refined, and transmitted culturally, and it spread relatively rapidly across continents, not through genetic inheritance but through cultural transmission as groups learned from neighbors or were displaced by expanding agricultural populations. With agriculture came a cascade of secondary technological innovations: pottery for storage and cooking, weaving for textiles, metallurgy for tools and weapons, architecture for permanent structures, writing for record keeping. Each innovation built upon previous ones, creating an accelerating pace of cultural and technological change. And critically, none of these developments required biological evolution. The humans who invented agriculture 12,000 years ago were biologically essentially identical to people living today. Their brains were the same size, their cognitive capabilities were the same, their sensory and motor abilities were the same. What differed was accumulated cultural knowledge, the vast library of information about tools, techniques, plants, animals, materials, social organization, and everything else that had been developed, refined, and transmitted across the tens of thousands of years since the bottleneck. This accumulation of cultural knowledge has only accelerated. The pace of technological change has increased exponentially. Changes that once took millennia now occur in centuries, decades, or years. The interval between major innovations has compressed dramatically. And all of this has happened without significant biological evolution. Humans 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, even 2,000 years ago were genetically and cognitively essentially identical to modern humans. A person born in the European Paleolithic, if raised in modern society, would be indistinguishable from any other modern human. They would learn language, master technology, understand abstract concepts, create art, and engage in all the complexities of modern life. Conversely, a modern infant raised in Paleolithic conditions would develop the skills and knowledge of a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. The biological potential is the same. What differs is the cultural environment and accumulated knowledge available. This represents a complete inversion of the relationship between biological and cultural evolution. For most of our evolutionary history, biology led and culture followed. Genetic changes created new capabilities that enabled new behaviors. After the bottleneck, culture increasingly took the lead. New behaviors and technologies changed the environment in which humans lived, sometimes creating new selective pressures that favored genetic changes, but more often simply allowing humans to succeed in new environments without biological adaptation. The result is the paradoxical situation we find ourselves in today. Biologically, we are adapted for the African savanna of 100,000 years ago, yet we live successfully in virtually every terrestrial environment on Earth, from equatorial rainforest to Arctic tundra, from deserts to high mountains, and even in entirely artificial environments like space stations. None of this would be possible without our cultural and technological adaptations. If you could somehow bring a baby from 70,000 years ago, shortly after the Toba event and the bottleneck, forward in time and raise them in a modern family, that child would grow up indistinguishable from any other person. They would learn to talk, read, write, use computers, drive cars, and navigate all the complexities of contemporary life. Their brain would develop normally, their intelligence would fall within the typical range, and their capacity for abstract thought, creativity, and innovation would be no different from that of any modern human. This thought experiment highlights a profound truth. Biologically, humans have changed remarkably little over the past 70,000 years, yet culturally, we have been completely transformed. We are, in a very real sense, Paleolithic bodies navigating a modern world, Stone Age brains flying jet aircraft and programming computers. Our biology has remained nearly static while our culture has undergone revolutionary change. The human brain provides the clearest example of this biological stasis. Average brain size, measured as cranial capacity, reached approximately modern levels by 200,000 years ago and has remained essentially unchanged since. If anything, average brain size has decreased slightly over the past 20,000 years, possibly as a consequence of smaller body size in agricultural populations. There has been no dramatic increase in brain size that could explain the explosion of cultural complexity that has occurred over this period. Moreover, examination of brain structure in fossil skulls, though necessarily limited by what bone can tell us about soft tissue, suggests that the basic organization of the human brain was established well before the bottleneck. The expanded prefrontal cortex, the asymmetries associated with language processing, the enlarged temporal lobes, all these characteristically human features were already present in anatomically modern humans 100,000 years ago and likely earlier in our evolutionary lineage. Genetically, humans today are barely different from humans of 70,000 years ago. The bottleneck reduced our genetic diversity drastically, and we have not had time since then to regain the variation that was lost. When geneticists sequence complete genomes from different modern humans, they find that any two people, regardless of geographic origin or ancestry, share about 99.9% of their DNA sequence. The variations that do exist, the 0.1% difference, mostly represent neutral changes that have no effect on function, or subtle variations in features like height, skin color, or disease susceptibility. There has been some continued biological evolution in humans over the past 70,000 years, of course. The evolution of light skin color in populations that migrated to high latitudes occurred during this period, driven by selection for vitamin D synthesis in low UV environments. The lactase persistence mutations arose and spread in dairy farming populations within the last 10,000 years. Populations living at high altitude have evolved better oxygen transport systems. Populations in malaria endemic regions show genetic signatures of selection for disease resistance. But these evolutionary changes are relatively minor and almost entirely involve adaptations to new environments or diseases, precisely the kinds of challenges that, before the bottleneck, would have driven more dramatic biological change. And notably, humans have succeeded in colonizing the entire planet despite these limited genetic changes. Populations without genetic adaptations to cold climates successfully occupy the Arctic using cultural adaptations like clothing and shelter. Populations without lactase persistence can thrive in dairy farming regions by processing milk products. People from sea-level populations can work at high altitude with appropriate acclimatization and technology. What has changed dramatically is culture. The accumulated knowledge, technology, social organization, and symbolic systems of human societies have undergone transformative change. To illustrate the pace of this cultural change, consider that 70,000 years ago, human technology consisted of stone tools, wooden implements, basic clothing and shelter, and perhaps simple watercraft. 10,000 years ago, some populations had developed agriculture, pottery, permanent settlements, and the foundations of civilization. 2,000 years ago, complex state societies with advanced architecture, writing, mathematics, and sophisticated technology existed across multiple continents. Today, we have computers, spacecraft, genetic engineering, and instant global communication. This represents a roughly million-fold increase in technological sophistication over 70,000 years, accomplished without significant change to the human brain or body. All of this complexity, the entire edifice of modern civilization, is built on the same biological foundation that existed after the bottleneck. We are not smarter than our Paleolithic ancestors in terms of raw cognitive capacity. We simply have access to vastly more accumulated cultural knowledge. This accumulated knowledge is what makes modern humans so much more capable than ancient humans despite having essentially identical brains. A modern person knows calculus not because they are smarter than ancient peoples, but because calculus was invented and the knowledge was preserved and transmitted. We can build skyscrapers not because we evolved better spatial reasoning, but because thousands of years of accumulated architectural and engineering knowledge, mathematics, material science, and practical experience have been encoded in cultural traditions and written records. Individual cognitive capacity has likely remained constant, but collective cultural knowledge has grown exponentially. Each generation inherits the accumulated knowledge of all previous generations and adds to it. Knowledge is not lost when individuals die because it has been encoded in cultural transmission systems. Initially oral traditions, later writing, now digital storage. This external storage of information allows human capabilities to far exceed what any individual brain could contain. Language plays a crucial role in this cultural accumulation. Complex ideas can be encoded in language and transmitted across vast spans of time and space. Written language makes this transmission more reliable and allows knowledge to persist across generations even if not actively practiced. Mathematical notation allows expression of quantitative relationships that would be impossible to convey through everyday language. Musical notation, chemical formulas, engineering drawings, computer code, all these are specialized symbolic systems that encode specific types of cultural knowledge. Social organization and specialization have also amplified human capabilities beyond what biology alone could produce. In a modern society, individuals can specialize deeply in narrow domains because they can rely on others for everything else. A research physicist can devote their life to understanding quantum mechanics because farmers grow their food, builders construct their house, teachers educated them, and a vast infrastructure supports their work. This specialization allows individuals to achieve depths of knowledge and skill impossible in more generalist lifestyles, and the collective result is technological capabilities that vastly exceed what any individual or small group could create. Education systems formalize the transmission of cultural knowledge. Rather than learning primarily through observation and informal instruction as in traditional societies, modern humans spend years in formal education specifically designed to transfer accumulated knowledge efficiently. This accelerates cultural evolution by ensuring that each generation starts with a higher baseline of knowledge and can push further into new territory. Scientific methodology represents perhaps the ultimate cultural adaptation, a formalized system for generating reliable new knowledge about the world. Science is not something humans evolved to do biologically. Rather, it is a cultural practice that has been developed and refined over centuries. The scientific method, systematic observation, hypothesis formation, experimental testing, peer review, is a set of cultural behaviors that, when followed, produces reliable knowledge despite the many cognitive biases and limitations of individual human minds. The result of all these cultural developments is that modern humans live in an entirely different world than our Paleolithic ancestors, despite being biologically almost identical. We perceive reality through cultural filters and conceptual frameworks that they lacked. We can think about abstract entities like atoms, genes, gravity, and space-time that have no direct sensory correlate. We manipulate the world through technologies that would appear magical to ancient peoples. We communicate instantaneously across the planet. We have extended human lifespan from perhaps 30 years on average for Paleolithic humans to 80 years in modern developed nations, not through biological evolution but through medical technology, sanitation, and accumulated knowledge about health. Yet underneath all this cultural sophistication, we remain Paleolithic humans. Our emotional systems are calibrated for life in small hunter-gatherer bands, not anonymous urban societies. Our dietary systems evolved for a world without processed foods, and the mismatch creates modern health problems. Our sleep cycles were shaped by natural light-dark cycles, not artificial lighting. Our stress responses evolved for immediate physical threats, not chronic psychological stressors. Much modern human suffering stems from these mismatches between our evolved biology and our modern environment. The fundamental point is this: the bottleneck, by reducing human genetic diversity and constraining biological evolution, created the conditions where cultural evolution became humanity's primary adaptive strategy. Unable to evolve biologically fast enough to keep pace with environmental challenges and opportunities, we evolved culturally instead. We became a species whose greatest adaptation is our capacity for culture itself. Our ability to learn, innovate, transmit knowledge, and build upon previous generations' achievements. This capacity has proven more powerful than any biological adaptation could be, allowing us to transform ourselves and our world at a pace millions of times faster than biological evolution. The story of Toba and the genetic bottleneck carries profound implications for how we understand human diversity, unity, and future potential. When we grasp that all humans descended from a small population of survivors, that our genetic diversity is remarkably low compared to other species, and that our primary adaptive strategy is cultural rather than biological, it reshapes our understanding of what it means to be human. First and most fundamentally, the bottleneck means that all humans are remarkably closely related. We are, in a very literal genetic sense, an extended family. Every person alive today can trace their ancestry back to the same small population of survivors who made it through the bottleneck. This is not a metaphor or poetic exaggeration, but a biological fact written in our DNA. Genetic studies examining the coalescence times of different human lineages, the point in the past when they last shared a common ancestor, reveal that most human genetic variation is young by evolutionary standards. The most recent common ancestor of all humans living today probably lived sometime between 150,000 and 300,000 years ago. Remarkably recent considering our species arose roughly 300,000 years ago. For some genetic markers, such as mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes which trace maternal and paternal lineages respectively, the coalescence times are even more recent, often within the time frame of the bottleneck. This means that the differences between human populations, the variations in skin color, facial features, height, and other visible traits that have historically been used to divide humans into races, are evolutionarily trivial. These differences arose recently, represent adaptations to local environments, and involve only a tiny fraction of our total genetic variation. The vast majority of human genetic diversity exists within populations rather than between them. Two randomly selected individuals from the same population are almost as genetically different from each other as two people from opposite sides of the globe. The concept of distinct human races, with meaningful biological significance, has been thoroughly rejected by modern genetics. The genetic variation between populations is continuous rather than discrete. There are no clear genetic boundaries that correspond to traditional racial categories. The physical features traditionally used to define race, skin color, hair texture, facial structure, are polygenic traits influenced by many genes, show continuous variation, and do not covary reliably with each other or with other aspects of biology. Moreover, because the bottleneck so drastically reduced human genetic diversity, even populations that have been geographically separated for tens of thousands of years remain genetically very similar. The time since the bottleneck has not been sufficient for substantial divergence. Humans simply have not had the genetic diversity or sufficient time for evolution to create the kinds of profound biological differences that exist among subspecies of other widespread species. This has important social and political implications. Racism and ethnic prejudice are built on false premises about deep biological differences between human groups. The scientific evidence shows clearly that these supposed differences do not exist. We are one species, one family, recently emerged from a small founding population, sharing nearly all our genetic heritage in common. The differences that do exist are overwhelmingly cultural rather than biological. The primacy of cultural over biological adaptation also has implications for how we think about human differences. When populations differ in practices, beliefs, technologies, or social organization, these differences reflect cultural evolution, not biological capacity. All human groups share the same fundamental cognitive capabilities, the same potential for language, abstract thought, innovation, and creativity. Differences in technological sophistication or social organization between societies reflect differences in historical circumstances, accumulated knowledge, and cultural transmission, not differences in innate ability. This understanding should promote humility about cultural achievements. Modern technological society is not advanced because modern humans are biologically superior to ancient peoples. We simply have the benefit of 70,000 years of accumulated cultural knowledge. An ancient human raised in modern society would be fully modern in their capabilities and thinking. Conversely, any modern human raised in ancient conditions would develop the knowledge and skills of ancient peoples. The bottleneck and the shift to cultural evolution also have implications for human unity in facing global challenges. Because we are so closely related genetically and because our success derives from cultural cooperation and accumulated knowledge rather than biological fitness, our future depends on our ability to work together as a species. Climate change, pandemic disease, resource depletion, nuclear weapons. These challenges affect all humanity and require collective solutions based on shared knowledge and cooperation. Our cultural adaptability, which served us so well in surviving and recovering from the bottleneck, remains our greatest asset. We can develop new technologies, social systems, and ways of thinking far faster than biological evolution could ever produce adaptive changes. We can share knowledge globally and build upon insights from diverse sources. We can consciously choose the directions of cultural evolution in ways impossible for biological evolution. However, this cultural power also creates new challenges. Our technological capabilities have outpaced our wisdom in using them responsibly. We can alter the planet's climate, create weapons of mass destruction, modify our own genomes, and build artificial intelligence that may exceed human capabilities in some domains. These are powers unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, and they come with profound responsibilities. The future of human evolution is likely to be primarily cultural and technological rather than biological. Our genetic evolution proceeds slowly because our population is large, because modern medicine and technology have relaxed many selective pressures, and because the timescales of biological evolution are long. Meanwhile, cultural and technological evolution continues to accelerate. In coming decades and centuries, humans will likely develop ever more powerful technologies for modifying ourselves and our environment. Genetic engineering, human-machine interfaces, artificial intelligence, space colonization. These technologies will create choices about human evolution that have never existed before. We could deliberately modify our genomes to eliminate genetic diseases or enhance capabilities. We could merge with machines, extending our cognitive abilities beyond their biological limits. We could separate into populations with different augmentations, creating divergence through technology rather than natural selection. We could upload our minds into computers, transcending biology entirely. These possibilities raise profound ethical questions that humanity must grapple with. If we can modify our biology technologically, should we? What should be enhanced and what should be preserved? Who gets access to enhancement technologies? Could technological modifications create new forms of inequality or even split humanity into divergent branches? How do we ensure that powerful technologies are used for human flourishing rather than harm? What is clear is that whatever choices we make, the biological foundation, the Paleolithic brain and body that emerged from the bottleneck with reduced genetic diversity, will remain the starting point. We are not infinitely malleable. Our biology constrains and shapes what is possible. Any future augmentations or modifications will build upon the platform created by evolution, including the bottleneck that reduced our diversity but also, perhaps, helped push us toward our distinctive reliance on cultural adaptation. Understanding this history, how we nearly went extinct, how we survived through cultural cooperation and innovation, how we became a species whose success depends on accumulated knowledge rather than biological fitness, provides perspective on who we are and where we might go. It reminds us of our unity as a species, our remarkable cultural adaptability, and our dependence on transmission of knowledge across generations. Most importantly, it highlights that our future is not predetermined by our biology but rather shaped by our choices. Unlike animals whose evolutionary trajectory is dictated by genetic variation and environmental selection, humans have gained some measure of control over our own evolution through culture and technology. This freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying. We can choose paths that lead to flourishing or to catastrophe. The outcome depends on the wisdom we bring to these choices. Wisdom that must be culturally developed, transmitted, and refined, just like the survival knowledge that carried our ancestors through the bottleneck in the innovations that have built modern civilization. And so, dear listener, we return to the present moment, to you resting comfortably as your breathing deepens and your mind begins its gentle descent towards sleep. We have traveled together through 74,000 years, from a mountain exploding in what is now Indonesia to the modern world of technology and global connection. We have witnessed how a volcanic catastrophe created conditions that nearly erased our species, reducing humanity to a genetic bottleneck that still shapes us today. What have we learned from this journey? We have learned that humans came remarkably close to extinction, that a combination of volcanic winter and ice age conditions created a crisis that killed most of humanity and reduced our genetic diversity to levels far below what we see in other primates. We have learned that this bottleneck fundamentally changed human evolution by constraining the genetic variation needed for rapid biological adaptation. We have learned that from this crisis emerged a new evolutionary strategy. Rather than adapting primarily through genetic changes, humans increasingly adapted through culture, technology, and accumulated knowledge. We became a species whose greatest strength is our ability to learn, innovate, and transmit information across generations. This cultural evolution has proven far more powerful than biological evolution, allowing us to colonize every environment on Earth and build civilizations of staggering complexity, all without significant changes to our brains or bodies. We have learned that all humans are family, descended from a small population of survivors who made it through the bottleneck. The differences between populations are evolutionarily recent, environmentally influenced, and biologically minor. Our unity as a species is not merely an ethical aspiration but a genetic reality. We are all branches of the same small family tree, remarkable similar despite our superficial differences. We have learned that our Paleolithic biology and modern culture coexist in fascinating tension. We are ancient bodies navigating modern worlds, Stone Age brains flying spacecraft. Many challenges we face stem from mismatches between our evolved psychology and contemporary environments. Yet this same biology, the capacity for language, abstract thought, cooperation, and innovation that emerged before the bottleneck, enables all our cultural achievements. As you drift deeper into rest, consider the remarkable fact that you carry in your DNA the story of survival. Your ancestors were among the fortunate ones who made it through the bottleneck, who endured volcanic winter and ice age cold, who adapted through ingenuity and cooperation when biological evolution could not save them fast enough. Every human alive today descends from those survivors. We are all heirs to their resilience, their creativity, their determination to persist against overwhelming odds. Consider too that the very capacity for sleep that now carries you toward unconsciousness is itself a product of ancient evolution. Your brain cycles through sleep stages that consolidate memories, process emotions, repair tissues, and prepare you for tomorrow. This biological rhythm was shaped by millions of years of evolution, yet the memories being consolidated tonight include knowledge and experiences that would be utterly alien to your Paleolithic ancestors. You dream with a Stone Age brain about a world they could not have imagined. The story of Toba teaches us about fragility and resilience in equal measure. Humanity has stood at the brink of extinction, reduced to numbers so small that our survival was uncertain. A few unlucky coincidences, a bit more volcanic output, slightly worse climate impacts, just one more unlucky event, might have erased us entirely. Life on Earth would have continued without us. Other species would have filled our ecological niche, and the universe would have been indifferent to our absence. Yet we survived, not because we were the strongest species or the fastest or the best adapted biologically. We survived because of something more subtle and more powerful. Our capacity to work together, to learn from each other, to remember and transmit solutions to problems, to innovate when circumstances demanded new approaches. Culture saved us when biology could not. And that same cultural capacity has carried us from those desperate days of survival to a world where humanity has become the dominant force shaping life on Earth. For better or worse, Our cultural and technological evolution has given us power unprecedented in the history of our planet. We can split atoms and splice genes. We can peer to the edges of the observable universe and down to the quantum foam of reality itself. We can create beauty that moves the soul and horrors that haunt the conscience. The responsibility that comes with this power is profound. Unlike biological evolution, which operates blindly through selection and chance, cultural evolution can be guided, imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely by conscious choice. We can decide what knowledge to pursue, what technologies to develop, what values to transmit to future generations. We can choose cooperation over conflict, sustainability over short-term gain, wisdom over mere cleverness. The survivors of Toba could not have imagined the world their descendants would build. They could not have conceived of cities, agriculture, writing, or any of the myriad innovations that would flow from the cultural adaptation strategy they employed for survival. Yet their choices, to persist, to cooperate, to innovate, set in motion a cascade of consequences that led ultimately to us, to this moment, to you listening to these words. In the same way, our choices today set in motion cascades of consequences that will shape futures we cannot fully imagine. The technologies we develop, the knowledge we preserve, the values we transmit, the problems we solve or fail to solve, all of these will influence whether humanity flourishes or falters in the millennia to come. We are not the endpoint of human evolution, but merely another step in an ongoing journey that began long before Toba and will continue long after us, if we make the right choices. But for tonight, these weighty concerns can rest. You have traveled back through deep time, witnessed catastrophe and survival, traced the arc from biological to cultural evolution, and contemplated what it means to be human in light of this history. Now it is time to let the knowledge settle into your mind as you settle into sleep. Take a slow, deep breath and feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort. Your muscles relax, your thoughts grow quieter, your breathing becomes slow and rhythmic. You are safe, you are resting, you are part of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back through the bottleneck to the very origins of humanity in Africa millions of years ago. As sleep claims you, know that you are part of something larger than yourself. A species that has survived apocalypses, adapted to every environment, built civilizations from nothing, and accumulated knowledge across thousands of generations. You are the inheritor of 74,000 years of cultural evolution, the beneficiary of countless innovations and hard-won insights. You are, in a very real sense, the universe become conscious of itself, matter organized in such a way that it can contemplate its own existence in history. Sleep well, knowing that your ancestors survived the bottleneck so that you could exist. Dream peacefully, secure in the knowledge that human resilience and creativity have carried us through challenges that would have destroyed lesser species. Rest deeply, trusting that the same cultural adaptability that saved humanity from Toba continues to enable our survival and flourishing today. And if you found this journey through time enlightening, if this story of survival and cultural evolution resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the remarkable story of humanity, bringing you content that educates and inspires while helping you drift into peaceful, restful sleep. Share this with others who might appreciate understanding how we came to be the unique species we are. Biologically ancient, culturally advanced, forever carrying the legacy of the survivors. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the story of Toba fade into dreams. Tomorrow awaits, a new day in the ongoing journey of humanity, and you will face it rested and renewed, carrying forward the cultural inheritance of 74,000 years of survival, innovation, and accumulated wisdom. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder of what our ancestors accomplished and the promise of what we might yet achieve.